On the 9th of July 1934, a woman with a camera stood at the foot of the brand new Isokon Flats. Her gaze travelled up its freshly painted concrete facade, over the galleries to the penthouse roof terrace, where a large party of guests were celebrating the grand opening of Britain's first modernist apartment block. When 25-year-old Edith Tudor-Hart was satisfied with her composition, she pressed the shutter. The images Edith shot that day were the culmination of a commission to document the historic construction and opening of the Isokon Flats. She was born Edith Suszycki into a middle-class Viennese family in 1908.
Well, they lived in a flat in a working-class district of Vienna because my grandfather, Wilhelm, and his brother very much believed in socialism. They had a bookshop and a publishing company called the Breuer Suszycki, and they published all sorts of left-wing literature, but also things on birth control, very much ahead of their time.
Vienna was devastated after the First World War, and Edith saw severe poverty at first hand. At the age of 16, she began working as a volunteer teacher in a nursery school. Her employers were so impressed by her promise that in April 1925, they sent her to London to train under the educationalist Maria Montessori. In Vienna, the Montessori movement contained a number of prominent communist members, and at some point around 1926 or 1927, Edith is thought to have joined the KPO, the Austrian Communist Party. She returned to London in 1927 and 1929, and it was there that she met and fell in love with the young English doctor, Alexander Tudor-Hart, who shared her left-wing views. In 1930, Edith was photographed by Central Branch at a Communist Party meeting in Trafalgar Square and was expelled from Britain. She returned to Vienna and decided to study photography at the Bauhaus in Dessau.
That was when Hannes Meyer was the director of the Bauhaus Dessau, and he was very political. It could be that one of the reasons she decided to study at Dessau was because of a strong communist presence. At the same time, we know that she studied with Walter Peter Hans, who was an important photographer, and that she was interested in modernist photography.
Certainly later, she has stated that photography was a way of documenting social injustice. And I think that was probably her motivation, rather than I want to be an artist.
Back in Vienna, Edith began working for the Soviet news agency TASS, and photo stories which she had shot in Britain in 1930 and 1931 were published in the Social Democrat Party's magazine.
She'd already taken some extraordinary photographs of Whitechapel and Caledonian Market. Those are photographs the type of photographs that didn't exist in Britain at the time. It was an idea of photography that had originated in Russia and that the Comintern at the time was promoting, which was proletarian photography, political photography, agitational photography, in order to encourage social change.
In May 1933, at the age of 24, Edith was arrested in Vienna and charged with carrying out courier services for the Communist Party. She was sentenced to a month in prison. In August, she and Alexander Tudor-Hart were married in Vienna, and she emigrated from Austria to England. Edith opened a photographic studio at 158 Haverstock Hill, close to the Isokon Flats, which were being designed by architect Wells Coates.
I suppose she knew Jack Pritchard and Molly from Beatrix Tudor-Hart, her sister-in-law, who was also a kindergarten Montessori teacher as she was. It was Jack Pritchard who set her in contact with Richard S. Lambert, the editor of The Listener, where some of her images have been shown over several years, and basically her career as a press photographer started in the UK after that.
The Pritchards commissioned Edith to take a series of family portraits with their two young sons, Jonathan and Jeremy. In 2022, photo historian Steffi Pirker discovered the long-lost negatives from this session in Tudor-Hart's archive at Fotohof in Salzburg. But that was not all she found.
Throughout my research, I looked through through the negative estate a few times, many times actually. And I found interesting material about a construction site in London. I knew it was done in the mid-30s, and it didn't take me long to research online that it was the Isokon Flats. And then I looked at the whole estate and found out there's approximately 35 images. So I suppose she was just commissioned with a family portrait shooting, and getting to know Jack Pritchard and having her studio quite close by here to Lawnflat Roads. That's when she got the commission for photographing the construction of Isokon Flats.
This shows us her interest in the idea of social housing. And although the Isokon building had been built with middle-class tenants in mind, Pritchard and Wellscote were very well aware of the Soviet and German experiments in social housing. So that's exactly the spirit that animates Edith. They are very powerful photographs. There is also always a humanist concern, as well as political, about the people that Edith Tudor-Hart photographed. And I would say that the same sort of concern was also extended to the building, because the way she photographed the building with the windows open, with the trees outside, with the dust on the floor, was something very new at the time.
Edith's images also contain valuable information on the building's construction process.
Now, some of these pictures look quite primitive now, but they actually tell us a good deal about how the building was built. What we're looking at here is a very interesting and informative picture which tells us about how the Isokon was constructed. And we can see that these concrete shuttering boards are about 3 feet high, which was the maximum height that you could pour concrete in those days for a domestic construction like this. The boards are metal-faced, and on the inside were tied compressed sheets of compressed cork, which provided the insulation to the inside of the building. In this instance, you've got these two chaps are barrowing concrete that's been mixed on site. So you were hoping that the consistency of the mix could be maintained throughout the whole contract, because it was just chaps putting stuff into a mixer and then throwing it into a barrow and then hoisting it up. There's no crane on this job. In those days, you would have a sand and cement screed and then use a plank like this on edge and then tap, tap, tap and work your way across the width of the gallery, which is what this gentleman's doing here. So that tells us how the galleries were prepared for their final asphaltic coating. Well, what we're seeing here is an image of the building almost complete. There's still pavement work to be done in the front here, but Edith has placed her camera in such a way that the angle of the light, it must have been late morning, I should think, on the day she took this, shows so clearly the image of the shuttering boards on these gallery walls here. And I think these pictures provide a fascinating document of the way in which this building was put together at the time, and we're very fortunate to have this record.
Edith also shot the flat's grand opening party on the penthouse rooftop terrace. 150 guests were invited, and the event was covered by the national press.
On these pictures, you can see the opening speech with Molly and Jack standing on the right and the kids here. They cracked open a bottle of ale on the balcony and later had a little party on the rooftop here. On the left, you can also see again Jack Pritchard in conversation and waitresses walking around with drinks. This is probably the most iconic and classic one of Lone Road Flats, and showing people from a frog eyes perspective who have been visiting the opening of the building that day. And she later used that photograph and basically mirrored it in a very interesting graphical way to create the first Christmas card for the building.
In that summer of 1934, Edith was also working with an old contact from Vienna, Arnold Deutsch, a Soviet spy recruiter who had moved into flat number 1 in the Isokon Flats. Deutsch asked her to find bright young graduates sympathetic to the cause who would be capable of infiltrating the British establishment. Her first thought was Kim Philby, with whom she had worked undercover in the communist movement in Vienna. She arranged a meeting between Philby and Deutsch on a bench in Regent's Park.
They wanted somebody who could access the sort of corridors of power in Britain in a way that someone like Edith, a Jewish foreigner, could not. So they together alighted on this idea of finding some English sort of, sympathetic Englishmen. And the first person who she recommended was Kim Philby, because he had shown himself not only to be in the position of power and to have the ability to really infiltrate the high society in the way that could really change things, but also this real willingness to take action.
Well, the important point was that Kim Philby had lots of friends at Cambridge who were interested as he was in helping the communist cause. So when he met Arnold Deutsch, he said to Deutsch, I've got some other people who'd like to join up the cause as well. And so he said, have you got their names? And so he handed over to Arnold Deutsch the names of people like Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, and that's how they then joined the networks. In other words, Deutsch followed up on all Philby's chums, and that's how the Cambridge Five was created. The Cambridge Five are basically the most important Soviet operation in the UK. They had other spying operations in other countries, but to have 5 people at the heart of the British government, seeing cabinet documents. Guy Burgess, one of them, knew every prime minister personally, actually not on first name terms. I mean, what a catch to have these people working for you. At times the KGB asked, is this for real? Is this some kind of MI5 stunt? But then they thought, no, the documentation seems genuine, because they were feeding industrial amounts of information to Moscow, sometimes so much that Moscow couldn't cope with all these documents arriving at the same time.
Photography was an important skill for communist agents, and so much so that in 1937 receipts came out showing that Edith Tudor-Hart had bought photographic equipment, cameras, for a very important Soviet operation to photograph documents at the Woolwich Arsenal.
In 1936, Edith gave birth to a son, Tommy. Alex Tudor-Hart left to join the Spanish Civil War, and when he returned in 1939, their marriage was over. Life as a single mother to a severely autistic child was difficult, but Edith continued working from her studio. She carried out portrait and fashion photography, commercial work for companies such as Boots the Chemist and Ilford Photo, and she documented other important modern buildings in her own distinctive style.
So the most important project was Kensal Rise, which is a sort of revolutionary social project in northwest London, which was built for the working classes as opposed to the Isokon building. So what is interesting, for example, about that project is that her photographs include women and children, mainly women and children. So women in the flats and children playing in the playground and in the nursery. So again, there is this connection between modern architecture, modernist architecture, and living, good living, which he always stresses. And another example is a project with her friend Erno Goldfinger on the shop for Abbott's Toys in West London.
Throughout this time, Edith was continually monitored by MI5.
It must have made her life very difficult, but she could never talk about it. It's extraordinary that they just kept watch on every movement. I mean, they knew where she was, what she was wearing, and therefore there is a record for us too. Myth has it that she burnt an awful lot of her negatives. I'm sure she burnt some. When the MI5 caught up with her and were looking for photographs or for documents of Philby, only according to my mother, because I obviously wasn't there, she put a lot of her negatives in the sink and set fire to them, and consequently had a breakdown.
In 1964, after being offered immunity from prosecution, Anthony Blunt, art historian and surveyor of the Queen's pictures, confessed to having been the fourth man of the Cambridge 5 spies. He revealed that Edith had been instrumental in their recruitment.
Such was the importance of Edith Tudor-Hart to what became the Cambridge 5, was that Anthony Blunt, when he was effectively found to be a spy and did a deal with MI5, he offered up the name of Edith Tudor-Hart and he called her the grandmother of us all. She was never, ever charged with anything. But to be honest, from MI5's point of view, they never gave up on her. And throughout her life, they were always going back to her. And that may be why she had a nervous breakdown, apart from a very complicated private life.
To escape from the stress and the constant surveillance, Edith moved to Brighton, where she largely gave up on photography and opened an antique shop. She continued to live there with her elderly mother, whom she had brought from Vienna, until her death in 1973.
A very memorable moment when I was in Moscow in 2010 and I was sitting at Kim's study, which is exactly as it had been last time I'd been there in 1988. And when I later zoomed in on the spines of the books behind me, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat next to Jeeves and Worcester, I spotted in the top left-hand corner was a framed copy of the photograph that is credited to Edith Tudor-Hart of Kim with the pipe, age 22, taken in 1930 in Vienna, that summer when it all started. I think that he kept that picture almost as sort of like an angel on his shoulder, reminding him of how he'd come to be where he was.
More than 50 years after her death, interest in Edith Tudor-Hart's work and her extraordinary life story continue to grow.
First of all, she was a very important Austrian-British exile photographer, and some of her work over the years and with intensive research is still being found, and it's just the whole spectrum of her photographic work enlarges over the years. She was a radical political Jewish woman who had to flee into exile and was followed by MI5 throughout her life.
You know, she photographed very poor people because that was what she wanted to document above all other things. Regrettably, in a way, it gets muddled up with her espionage career, I think, because actually as a photographer standing alone, I think she's well worth the interest that is now, at last, forthcoming.